I'm Stephen Goldstein and my co-host is Mark Randall, and this is a podcast where we discuss all aspects of the behavioural, psychological, mental and emotional aspects of trading and investment performance and how these shape the way people in these jobs generate profits and excess returns, otherwise known as alpha. Today we are joined by one of my favourite authors on the subject of behavioural finance, psychologist Dr Daniel Crosby.
Your brain could not be any worse designed to be an investor. You couldn't do it. There's not one good thing about the way that your brain is designed when it comes to investing. Your brain wants certainty. Markets are all about uncertainty. Your brain hates risk. Markets are all about risk. Your brain is made to optimize the here and now. Markets require you to invest in an unknown future. There's nothing about your brain that's well positioned to invest. Paradoxically, the secret to being great is realizing that you're not that great. If you can keep your emotions in check, if you can manage your ego, and you can avoid, watching the news and getting too sucked into loss aversion, then I think you're on your way. But it's, of course, easier said than done, because managing behavior is one of the most difficult things you could ever do.
Daniel is a best-selling author of several leading books on behavioural finance and is renowned throughout the industry. He is also Chief Behavioural Officer at the major investment firm Brinker Capital, and Daniel also hosts his own excellent podcast on the subject called Standard Deviations. Behavioural finance is a fascinating field that I believe every trader and investor should know more about. It is a study of the influence of psychology and social factors on the financial behaviour of people. Its popularity from a largely isolated field to a topic which is now largely mainstream has been a feature of the last 10 to 15 years. What I really like about Daniel's work, whether it is in his books, his podcasts, his blogs, or the excellent TED Talks he has given, is how he brings passion and humanity to a subject which can at times come across as rather dry and academic. He also brings an applied and practical perspective to the topic. And this for me is one of the things that I really enjoy about reading his work, and particularly his most recent book, Behavioural Investing, which I feel is one of the best books on the topic. I would also highly recommend viewing and listening to some of his TED Talks, including the excellent You're Not That Great, a motivational speech. Now, before we start, a few words about the Society of Technical Analysts. We are delighted to be associated with the Society of Technical Analysts, or the STA, the world's oldest body for the advancement of education in the field of technical analysis and the study of price action. The STA run outstanding education programs and diplomas, including an excellent home study course and diploma programs delivered at some of the world's leading academic institutions by some of the leading people within the field of technical analysis. You can find out more about the STA at their page sta-uk.org. Now, on with the podcasts, and welcome to Dr. Daniel Crosby.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both for having me. Joining today from rainy Atlanta, Georgia. So it's great to be with you both. In terms of me and my backstory, I have a sort of a winding road to the world of behavioral finance. My father was and is a financial advisor, and so I grew up from a very young age talking at the dinner table about what shares to buy and how to invest and how to make good financial decisions. I went to college unsure, I think like many young kids, of what I wanted to do, but immediately fell in love with my psychology courses when I started taking those. But really set out to be a therapist, and so got a bachelor's degree in psychology, then went straight on. 3 days after graduating with my bachelor's, I started a PhD program in psychology and was sort of on a path to be a therapist. But in the midst of that program, in the midst of that doctoral program, I really burnt out on doing clinical work. I really burnt out on the medical side of psychology. It was just candidly very stressful, talking to 40 or 50 people every week who were suicidal or just having really tough times was taking its toll on me. And so I said, look, I still love to think about why people do the things that they do. I still love to think about human behavior, but I want to do this in a non-clinical setting. And, that's when my dad sort of planted this first seed of, well, there's a lot of psychology in what I do. And I was sort of looked at him funny and was like, what are you talking about? And had never really given much thought at that young age to there being a great deal of behavior in capital markets. But, fast forward, my first job, my first job out of PhD school was at a bank, and I quickly became introduced to the field of behavioral economics. And sort of the rest is history. So I am trained as a clinician, and so I bring, I think, a little bit of a unique perspective to the conversation around behavioral finance, because my training was to eventually become a shrink and not to become an economist.
Very interesting story, Dan. I think what sort of resonates with me is that you converted from this clinical sort of driven background into the real world of markets. And of course, there's a huge difference between the two. And very often people can't transition that easily. And it's good to see that you've done that. And clearly you can bring a whole range of skills to the team that you work with, having that background. Has there been anything in particular that from that background training that you're sort of noted for within the team and your role at the moment? Do people sort of call on you for particular skills that are just unusual in the field?
Well, I think in terms of the usefulness of a medical background or a clinical background, I would say the most important thing that I learned in grad school was to be non-defensive. And of course, this is a very important skill for any trader or investor. So when training to be a clinician, I was 23 years old when I started seeing clients, which I think you and I will both agree, you're not in a great spot to dispense wisdom about life at 23 years old. And so I'm sitting with these people who are in pain, these people who want my advice for some inexplicable reason. And so what we would do is we would have these sessions, and then afterwards we would watch the tape the same way that an athlete watches tape. My peers and my professors would go back and look at the time that I had spent with this client and say, stop the tape. Why did you say that? That was stupid. And criticize everything from your interventions to your body language to your thinking. And at first that was very, very tough. I think that at first that was very, very tough. And I think it's tough for traders. It's tough for investors when they read books like mine, and it maybe starts to smart a little bit because they start to recognize themselves in some of the errors that I talk about. But you have to push past that. And so in some respects, I don't use very much of what I learned at all, like in my doctoral program. But in other respects, the broader tendency to be able to take critical feedback, to be self-critical, to be self-reflective and introspective, I think that's one sort of meta skill that served me very well professionally. And I candidly wish everyone got this. I wish you had to do this whether you served at a lunch counter or a bank teller or drove cab or whatever. I think everyone would be a little better off if they had some deeper training in how to think about their own behavior and to be critical of their own behavior. So that part served me quite well, I think.
Yeah, and I guess associated with that is the management of self during that critique process, because of course, if we do have a tendency to beat ourselves up and to be overcritical, there's a tendency that we may stay in that world of not being in the real time, real moment, because we're somewhere else thinking, why am I so bad at doing this stuff and why aren't I better? And that dwelling can become a problem. So clearly, I imagine that with the processes that you've learned in the past, you've also got a degree of self-management that fits into that as well.
Well, I think you make a great point, because my mistake, and I think many people's mistake early on when you receive a piece of critical feedback or, again, read something that may cast a negative light on your behavior, is you push back on that, or you conflate your criticism of your behavior with a criticism of your core self. And so one of the things that I had to do is to decouple those things, to disentangle, like, look, I can make stupid decisions and not be a stupid person. I can screw up and not be a screw up fundamentally. And I think when we start to decouple those things, we move through the world in a much more carefree way, and we're much more open to critical feedback.
Interesting. Steve, how about your side from your angle?
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting thing, this idea of of getting feedback, and it is so hard to receive feedback. It's so hard to not shut it out. And I think this is one of the great opportunities many people in the trading world and the investment world, it's one of the areas they miss out on. You know, the market is talking to them the whole time. Their situation and context, the people around them is providing feedback, and it's always being missed. I mean, it's so often being missed.
Yeah, so I want to take a minute and talk about this feedback that you brought up. You know, one of the things that I love about working in financial markets is feedback is going to happen whether you like it or not. Like there's no such thing as not getting feedback, whether you're getting it from a trading coach or whether you're just getting it from the numbers that are flashing on your screen. You know, feedback is more or less inevitable. And so it's really about, do you want to take that and learn from it? When you get feedback, you're brought to a crossroads. And at that crossroads, you can either take it, learn from it, and improve, or ignore it and, you know, stay in the same rut and repeat those same mistakes until you're broke. And so I think it's important for us to just own the fact that feedback is going to occur whether or not we like it. Now, when it comes to interpersonal feedback, you know, you as a coach giving feedback or me receiving feedback, I think the meta concern here is that we give feedback in order to make someone else look better. You know, I think sometimes in life, the reason people don't like feedback is because feedback has sort of become a euphemism to stick it to someone, you know, to tell them something to embarrass them, to make them look bad. And I think that sometimes happens in the workplace under the guise of feedback. But I think feedback truly delivered is all about improving someone's behavior. So I think it's, you know, important to, you know, first of all, understand that the market's going to give you feedback whether or not you want it. So be prepared to accept it and learn from it. And then the second thing to consider is when we're giving feedback, you know, interpersonally, to always ask ourselves, you know, am I doing this to make this person look better? Am I patting my own ego here? Or is this really aimed to make that person look better? Because one of the things that I cannot quite quantify yet, I'll work on it. But one of the things I can't yet quantify, but know to be true, is that people have a sixth sense for inauthenticity. People can always tell when you're giving feedback out of bad faith or giving feedback that's meant to harm, even if it's ostensibly, you know, on the up and up. People can smell bad intentions, and so we have to make sure our intentions are pure. So in terms of what I do at Brinker, a lot of my work, our clients are financial advisors. So really what I'm doing is I'm helping financial advisors to help retail accounts, retail investors make good decisions. So I'm, you know, effectively training them on how to train their clients. And, you know, it's fantastic because whether it's in trading, whether it's in retail finance or financial advice, there's just a huge enthusiasm for behavioral finance, and people are really, really hungry for this, and they don't always know how to start applying it. And so the enthusiasm around my work's been absolutely fantastic to see.
And in terms of that, what is the starting point? Where do you start with the clients, the people who you say have got this hunger and they really want to know about it, but they're coming in with no understanding of it, and there's this, I mean, it's such a huge topic. Where would you
so it is a huge topic. It's a great question. So I have these 3 E's, right? These 3 E's of managing people's behavior. Because managing behavior is one of the most difficult things you could ever do, whether you're trying to manage someone else's behavior or trying to manage your own behavior in the context of not blowing up your trading account. It's one of the most difficult things you could do. We know in the U.S., I'll give you examples that I know from the U.S. In the U.S., about 40% of people get some sort of financial advice, but less than half of them take that advice. If you look at people who get sick, only about a third of people who get sick go to the doctor. Among people who go to the doctor, less than half of them take their medication. So like we as a human race are enormously hard-headed. And so first of all, I think when you're undertaking, whatever behavioral journey you're trying to go on, I think you have to have respect for how difficult this is. Here we are in mid-February. There's a reason why only about 7% of New Year's resolutions get adhered to, because already here in February, it's all gone to hell, right? For most people, we've already forgotten about everything. I'll speak for myself. We've already forgotten about everything we were so fervent about just a couple of weeks ago. So the three pillars here of trying to change human behavior that we can talk about, the first is education. The second is environment, and the third is engagement. So I'll start with education, and we can take a quick pause after that. Education is, of course, I would say it's necessary but not sufficient. Okay, so if you look at education around the way that people make decisions here in the U.S. In the early 90s, the government started to label all of our food, so fat, calories, all that kind of stuff. And since that time, the average American has gotten twice as fat, and morbid obesity has risen 3x in that time. So it's a good starting point, right? You need to be able to make informed decisions, and education is a necessary first step there. But it's still a very, very weak predictor of doing the right thing. So actually, a lot of what education is what I'll call meta-knowledge. Knowledge is knowing a thing. Meta-knowledge is knowing when you don't know. And so a lot of what education around behavioral finance can do is to just help people know what they don't know, to help me know, is this investment outside of my circle of competence? Is this a time when I need to bring in a coach? Do I need to sit with this one out, or do I need to jump in? Do I need to grab it with both hands? And so, I don't have the knowledge of how to fix my car, but I do have the meta knowledge to know that I don't know, so I don't try. Right? So I don't try to fix my car. I take it to a professional. And so meta-knowledge is an important and I think underappreciated part of this first pillar of education, which is a great place to start, but is sadly by itself not as powerful as it could be.
It's great. I mean, it actually feeds into a few topics I wanted to talk about. And maybe we can refer to the other two, because, a lot of this is, and a lot of the talk around behavioural finance is about rational behaviour. That's often the big buzzword that's discussed when people talk about behavioural finance. It's how can I be more rational? And I've been listening to a fascinating podcast recently about the situation with vaccines, and the pro-vaccine argument and the anti-vaccine argument. And this podcast spoke to people from both sides of it. And actually, I mean, obviously I'm sitting there thinking, there cannot be an argument for the anti-vaccine side. But then when you listen to the anti-vaccine argument, she actually makes what seems like a very rational case, as she puts it. And then you're sitting there going, well, what does rational mean? She's given a rational argument for, and someone else has given a rational argument against. So it becomes, and this is what happens in financial markets. Rational means different things to different people. One of the arguments on the against argument was people didn't want to have regret. And as we know, regret aversion is a bias in financial markets, in behavioural finance. So I just wanted to get your view on that, perhaps.
No, I think you're exactly right. Rational is one of those terms that, unfortunately, I use more than I should. I think a superior term is adaptive, because whether or not something's adaptive or maladaptive takes context into account. Because there's all sorts of things you could do that are not rational in the strictly utility maximizing sense. But it's adaptive, right? Like my family and I are about to pay off our house, and our interest rate on the house is lower than what I assume I could make in the markets. So in some ways, it's an irrational behavior for me to put money down on a house where I could invest that in the markets and potentially achieve a superior return. So in the strictest utilitarian sense, that's an irrational act. But it buys me peace of mind. It helps me feel a sense of accomplishment. It helps me sleep well at night. And it's not to my financial detriment in any meaningful sense. So, like, knock yourself out. So I think there's a nuanced conversation to be had, and I absolutely agree that adaptive is the superior term. With respect to the vaccines argument, I talked about the vaccines argument in my new book, The Behavioral Investor, and it brings up this backfire effect, and it's one of the limitations of education. So you read in the U.S., some of the most stridently anti-vaccine folks out there are some of the wealthiest. So the places where you're seeing recurrences of polio and mumps and weird stuff that we had gotten rid of 100 years ago is in places like Southern California, where people are sort of educated enough to have talked themselves into these, quote, what is effectively a bad idea. And you yourself even said, it kind of stuck with you, it kind of made a certain sense. And so when you talk to someone who has a strong opinion, in this case, people who are against vaccines, and you try and educate them, you sort of, pound the table, if you will, and say, no, you should vaccinate your kids because of this study and this study and this study and this study. They actually found that people doubled down on their unscientific beliefs when you came at them strictly with education. And so this is one of those limits of education, is this backfire effect that if you enter into a conversation with a pre-existing strong belief, education doesn't do much to change it. And I think, many of the political goings on that you see happening all over the world right now are sort of resistant to education. Like, it doesn't matter what makes sense. It just matters what makes emotional sense, or emotional sense. And so education is a tricky one. And I see people saying, oh, look, we need to be educating our kids. We need to be educating our kids about finance. Well, sort of. Like, we need to do more than we're doing now, perhaps, but it's certainly far from a panacea.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that thank God we've all got different views, right? Because if it'd be a funny old market if we were all one way and all convinced that our piece of education is the way that everything is. So, but I think the source of education is quite critical as well. The authenticity behind it. This whole thing of what is it? The fake news and everything. We think we can be tuned into the right education, but we could be getting totally tripped up because we've tuned into the wrong source. So the authenticity of education and the authenticity of the person providing it is pretty important. But there's no guarantee that any one of us is plugged into the right feed. We're getting tripped up all the time.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right there. And so one of the things that I wrote about in my book is, like, in this era of fake news, and at a time when so many purveyors of financial news have a financial interest in perhaps being either overly optimistic or overly cataclysmic, right? Both of these, massively bullish and massively bearish cases have their own camps, and they sell their own subscriptions and have their own adherents. There's really three things that I think the behavioral investor needs to look for to determine the veracity of news, whether or not news is real. So the first thing is, can we find evidence in the data? Okay, so like look at the data, look at the research. Do we see evidence there? But that alone is not enough. Most people, if they do anything, so first of all, most people do nothing to try and, verify their news sources. But then if people do anything, a lot of times they'll look up one or two studies that confirm their priors, and then that's it. So first we want to look at the data, but we can't stop there. Second, we have to ask if it makes any philosophical sense. Is there a reason? Is there a theoretical underpinning to this idea? And then finally, we need to see, is there a behavioral component to it? And I'm talking about market data at this point, right? Because if you think about things, there's all kinds of silly indicators, right? There's the Super Bowl indicator. There's the fact that Bangladeshi butter production has corresponded a 95% correlation with the S&P 500 over many, many years. Like the data are there, right? But it's nonsensical. So you dismiss those data because there's just too many data points now. And if you regress them all against each other, you're going to find some really stupid stuff. So you got to have the data, but you got to have the theory. And if you want it to persist, if you want it to be an enduring investment factor, it has to have a behavioral component to it. So everything from trend to value to momentum, all of these things have behavioral components to them, and that's why we, have reason to think that they'll persist.
So if I'm a retail trader, if I can just ask this question, Steve, if I'm a retail trader, let's just say, for example, listening in on this, and I'm thinking, okay, so how do I adjust my process? I mean, I'm going to tee up a trade, think of a trade. In terms of what you've just mentioned, what do I need to be doing differently just to make sure I'm tuned into the right decision process?
So first of all, I mean, we could. I don't know where the two of you fall down on this. So this is sometimes fighting words, but everything that I read suggests that you should automate your process. So I mean, that would be sort of my first behavioral tip and trick, is to say, look, come up with a rules-based process. All of the research shows that rules beat discretion. There's very little debate about that anymore. So whatever your process is, there's a million good ways to trade, but whatever it is, make sure that it's automated and stick with it. The second thing I would say, though, is you have to really seek out disconfirming evidence. All of us, and I do mean all of us, are prone to confirmation bias. So if we have an idea, we tend to, again, go cherry pick the data that exists with that idea, and then we don't want to have our thinking questioned. So you have to actively go and seek out smart people who are counterparties to your trade, smart people who take the other side of that, and you have to think. And you have to literally spend twice as much time on the contrary position as on your own. Because if left to our own devices, we tend to read longer, listen more, and engage more with opinions that support our own. And so you really, really have to work overtime to get that there. So I think if you can have a process that is systematic, a process that looks at the three things I just talked about, investment factors that are data-driven, that have a behavioral component, and that have an element of sense-making or undergirding philosophy. And I think if you seek out contrary opinions, I think you're sort of on your way as a behavioral investor.
Okay, so I'm going to pick up the middle one, because we're talking about something that's very, very, I suppose you could say, almost a central tenet of the behavioural finance literature, which is the confirmation bias, and trying to sort of disprove that. And I adapted my own process when I was a trader. So I was a trader for nearly 25 years at investment banks. And I remember being struck, I think it was in the very early 2000s, by an article I read by James Montier, who, I don't know if you're familiar with his work.
He's great.
Yeah. So he was one of the first people to write about this in an applied sense in the investing world, and I was really struck by some of the, I kept thinking of, he gave these lists of errors people were making around their process, and I was looking at them and I was going, yeah, that's me. Yep, do that as well. And that, and I was going through and I'm like, God, I'm a complete loser. How have I managed to survive this long somehow? And, one of the things I recognized in a huge degree was my tendency to try and confirm my beliefs or my views. And there was something very egotistical about that as well. So if I got into a particular story or narrative, I would then seek out the evidence that supported that. And I would find myself engaging with the people who were also on the same story. And it was, it led me down some dreadful rabbit holes as a trader. And one of the things I did was to turn that around and actually start finding the counter stories, the counter arguments to the narratives I had or that I favoured or that I'd bought into, or the belief systems that I was buying into. And I started to find that my whole process started to become more robust. I started to find that I was actually taking less trades, and the ones that I were taking were better trades. They had better risk reward scenarios. And it was just, it didn't happen overnight, but I really noticed this pattern happening, and it became, my latter years went through a very big improvement for many reasons, and that was one of the big reasons behind it. But not enough people do that, and I wish I'd known that. I wish I'd been educated about that. When I started out, when you talk about education and engagement as well, I wish I could have engaged with that as well. I mean, so it is one of the tenets, and of course you there talking about systemizing trading as well as a key core aspect, moving away from discretionary trading. I mean, are you talking about in the investing world there, or are you talking about in the trading world, or because again I meet a lot of systemic traders now, or systematic traders, but there's still a lot of discretion in their process, depending how far the process is from the actual creation of the system itself to the actual management and the monitoring of the system. And I've come across a lot of people who are engaging, almost in confirmation bias in the building of their system, that they're actually curve fitting very early in the process.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a very important point. So, here we are in this world of AI and machine learning, and what you're finding is that these systems are only as good as their designers, and they're only as bias-free as their designers. So here in the States, there was recently a big case around sort of an HR hiring software. And they said, oh, look, we're going to save HR professionals all this time by sort of systematizing and automating the early sorting through of resumes. Well, what they found was that the early sorting through of resumes was racist. It was, and it sort of adopted all the racial bias of the individuals who had been doing it historically. So yes, being systematic is not, even the creation of a system must be undertaken with a heavy dose of skepticism. And you should get people to poke holes in that system. You should read articles that denigrate that system. I think the different camps of investing are sometimes highly critical of each other. It was interesting to see Zero Hedge get kicked off of Twitter recently because you've got one contingent of FinTwit saying, no, there goes our news source. And then you've got another contingent of Twitter saying, ding dong, the witch is dead. And, sort of probably the truth is somewhere in the middle. And so it's just important, I think, that even in the creation of a system to be thoughtful about how you arrived at those things and not curve fit. It's very, very important not to do that. Because again, we look in the US Fed reports 45,000 pieces of economic data each year. If you regress those against each other, a lot of silly stuff is going to come out. A lot of what looks like signal is just going to be noise. And so you have to be very, very thoughtful about the creation of your process. And I think you also need to predetermine at which points might you revisit that process and, see if it's still working. I think a lot of value managers are sort of having a come to Jesus moment right now about, does this stuff even work anymore? And but you also have to be careful, because the tendency is going to be to abandon that factor at the very moment when it's poised for success.
We will return to the podcast shortly, but first we want to tell you about our association with the Society of Tennochemists. The STA are one of the world's leading bodies for training and educating investment specialists and traders. The STA run distance learning programs and diplomas in technical analysis. They also run accredited diploma programs at such prestigious academic institutions as Queen Mary University of London, King's College, and the London School of Economics. To find out more about the Society of Technical-Analysts, please visit their page, sta-uk.org. Now back to the podcast.
If the trader doesn't know the source and it comes back to this education sort of authenticity again. If you don't know the source of the stuff that's been put together for you to trade, then ask this question: Is it right? Is it right? And you've got almost, I think, an obligation for yourself as a trader to really understand what you've got driving your decision making, even if it is, code driven.
Absolutely. I mean, your decisions, your data-driven decisions will only ever be as good as your data. And so, I mean, that's point number one. I think you're spot on. I absolutely agree there. The second thing that I would say is that there's sort of this idea of motivated neglect and motivated skepticism. So if I get on the scale and I like the number that I see, I jump off the scale and I go about my day. If I get on the scale and I don't like the number that I see, I step off the scale. I step on more gingerly and I try and get a second opinion, right? I mean, you do the same thing at the doctor. You go to the doctor, you get a clean bill of health. You go, cool, great. If you go to the doctor, they say you have cancer. You go, wait a minute. I'm going to get a second and a third opinion. The same thing happens with our trades. Like if a trade goes our way, oftentimes we never give it another thought. But there are a host of reasons why a trade could go your way that say nothing good about you or your system. So it's a very counterintuitive thing to think that we need to really look at every trade, good or bad. A trade that goes against you can go against you for reasons that leave you with no fault, that leave your system with no fault. It's just bad luck. And conversely, you can have something go just your way, and it can be no boon to your decision making or to your system. So that's one of the most counterintuitive things about markets, is that we need to be constantly vigilant in good times and bad. Most people don't even look at this until things go wrong, and then it's usually to try and let themselves off the hook, not to deeply understand something.
You're talking about, as I understand it, sort of dealing with uncertainty, dealing with complexity. And again, you can do everything right by your process. And as you know, it can go completely against you. And it's almost having the mindset to deal with that, not to blame yourself. And likewise, you can just flip a lucky trade and it can go really well. And you think you're the king. And,
yeah.
And it's almost that ability to sort of stand back. And, what are the things that make a great investor? You've talked about the three things. In your opinion, a great investor, a great trader, a great master of the world of risk, from a behavioural finance perspective.
Yeah, so from a behavioral standpoint, so I would answer this a couple of ways. Just to revisit and maybe put to bed those first three E's. You need the right education, you need the right environment, which is in this case your right portfolio, one that you can live with, one that you can stand the volatility of. And then that third piece is you need engagement. You need that just-in-time feedback. This is where, for a retail investor, you might need an advisor. For a trader, you might need a coach, right? You need someone who in a moment of panic you can call and say, I'm thinking this, am I losing my mind? Like, we all need that encouragement, that engagement. So those are the three things. If you're talking about sort of the four behavioral characteristics I wrote about in the Behavioral Investor, these are sort of four personal psychological demons we have to master, if we will. The first of them is ego, which is effectively overconfidence in its many forms. The second one is emotionality, which is, just what it sounds like, the tendency to privilege the heart over the head. The third one is attention, which is this tendency of us to confuse what is easy to recall with what is likely. And then the fourth one is conservatism, which is our natural tendency to be loss averse, ambiguity averse, and status quo prone. So if you can keep your emotions in check, if you can manage your ego, and you can avoid, watching the news and getting too sucked into loss aversion, then I think you're on your way. But it's, of course, easier said than done, big time.
That brings me actually to a wonderful quote. It's from your book, The Behavioural Investor. And I'm going to read it back to you. Like a flower growing through the pavement, your brain is beautiful, but out of place. It was formed for a place and purpose long since abandoned, and your ability to create and sustain wealth is in a real sense predicated on understanding this misfit. Animals use their brains to look out on the world, but it is a unique human capability to look within. We must use the mind to understand the mind, to first know ourselves.
Absolutely gorgeous. What genius wrote that? Okay, no, thank you.
I wanted to ask you where that came from. What were you on mushrooms at the time?
I live a very clean life, so no, I can tell you I was not on mushrooms at the time. No, but I am. Oh, I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, so the one of the main themes of the Behavioral Investor, as you know, is that the things that have served us well evolutionarily don't serve us well in capital markets. I mean, your brain and your body were effectively made to live 30, maybe 40 years, to pass on your genes and then die. I mean, that's kind of what we're equipped to do. And so when people say, oh, I'm not happy, like your brain never meant for you to be happy. Like, happy is sort of out of, happy is not what we're made for. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be happy or we shouldn't strive for those things. But your brain and your body, make no mistake, are designed to avoid big disasters, to pass on your genes, and that's about it. And so, we live in a world where our brain has not substantially changed in 150,000 years, and yet capital markets, well-developed stock markets are 450 years old. So our brains and our bodies are made for an entirely different environment, entirely different milieu than the one that we currently find ourselves in. So understanding that fundamental misfit is a big first step to making better choices.
Yeah, that's super important, particularly when you start to look at the negative reaction that we have from a mental perspective to risk and stress and those sorts of things, and then the ancient reaction, not being for a moment but lingering with us, and we're taking it to bed with us, and we're waking up with it, and we're getting worse and worse, loss aversion, and we can't see ideas, and it all starts to get really sort of a holistic problem for us. So yeah, we need to recognize that our platform needs managing from a mental perspective, and a lack of self-management in that respect is a mistake, particularly if you're a trader. So yeah, I recognize that, and a lot of my work goes into this fact that we're an ancient animal trying to make sense of this modern world, and the more complex role we have, the more risks we've got from a mental state of management that we need to be on top of and be proactive about. And if we start losing money, then we've almost only got ourselves to blame for not being in the right mindset to be able to optimize any current situation.
Loss aversion makes total sense in an evolutionary sense, because if your body's main job is to pass on its genes, you have one bad day, a couple thousand years ago, and that's it. Like, you're sunk. And but you have a good day, and like no big deal. You got to have 1,000 other good days to live on, to pass on your genes. And so, this is why. This explains every single problem we have with money. Like, why do people never have enough money? Why are people always pushing for more? Why is it that millionaires and billionaires aren't any happier than people who have far less wealth than them? Well, your body didn't design you to be satisfied. Your body designed you to keep going and to always be sort of perpetually dissatisfied, because dissatisfaction and this feeling of not enough brings action, brings work. And historically, when you were living on nuts and berries, that's what you needed. You couldn't amass the kind of wealth that you can today. So this fundamental problem that we're talking about explains everything from loss aversion, the asymmetries around ambiguity aversion and loss aversion, all the way to what's called the hedonic treadmill, which is this idea that we can basically never have enough stuff or enough money. This one simple idea explains a ton about our financial behaviors.
So would you, I mean, if I'm conscious of the time, and we're close to the end of this call, and I feel we've barely tapped the surface, unfortunately. But this concept which you just talked about of, the brain, the mind it's not ideal for this market. So it's almost like we have to somehow unlearn what we've learned almost as a species over thousands of years, and then somehow relearn. And it comes back to education. And should this, in your opinion, this behavioural finance education, be taught almost at entry level for anyone going into this field, to give them the basic understanding of these concepts?
Yeah, so I'll bring it back to this meta-knowledge, right? Because your brain could not be any worse designed to be an investor. Like, I mean, you couldn't do it. There's not one good thing about the way that your brain is designed when it comes to investing. Like, right, your brain wants certainty. Markets are all about uncertainty. Your brain hates risk. Markets are all about risk. Your brain is made to optimize the here and now. Markets require you to invest in an unknown future. Like, there's nothing about your brain that's well positioned to invest. And so education is important, but I think it's this meta knowledge again. You need enough education to know what kind of portfolio you can live with. You need enough education to know how to automate your process so you're not perpetually meddling and mucking it up. You need enough education to know that you need a coach or a financial advisor or some sort of accountability partner to do better, because you are never, I promise you, you will never muscle your way into good decision making simply by reading my books, right? Like, as much as I wish that were the case, it will never happen. It's a first step, but you got to keep going.
Yeah, I came across an article. It was a brilliant article a few weeks ago. This guy was trying to assess the success rate of traders in this trading room environment. So he'd been working in a proprietary trading room in the US, and I think he'd been through the data. They had about 400 people go through there over a number of years. And he was trying to work out the success rate, which was it was a little bit of finger in the air going on with it. But he'd reckoned, using the metrics that he'd allowed for it, that about 4.5% of all the traders that went through that room were successful. But when he then looked at the traders who all had mentoring of some sort, or paid for mentoring, he said they had about a 10% success rate. And that mentoring is that accountability. It's that person that you can go to. So, people might say, well, maybe that's not a lot, but actually improved their success rate by over 100%.
Yeah, you improved it by 250% off of an awfully low base, but yeah,
Off
that's
a low base.
that's
Yeah,
true.
that's what I said. It was quite anecdotal, but I haven't seen anything else yet. I've seen research, but there's a lot of research out there about the success rates. There's so many qualifiers in all those bits of research as well.
Yeah.
But I mean, you must see it with your client base. You've probably got a great chance to look into this and see where this impacts. I don't know if you've ever done anything there.
No, I've never done original research, but I know there was a pretty robust study out of Taiwan looking at Taiwanese day traders who were do-it-yourselfers. And of these do-it-yourself Taiwanese day traders, they found that 1 in 360 of them showed skill. Like this is perhaps the point that is the point of all points here is if you're going to undertake this, there is an exceedingly uphill climb here. And you mentioned one of my TEDx talks, my first TEDx talk, called "You're Not That Great," and the whole thrust of that talk is that if we just realize that we're pretty mediocre, like if we accept from the outset that we're not that great, it'll bring a sort of humility into our lives that will actually allow us to do great things. Like sort of paradoxically, the secret to being great is realizing that you're not that great. When you realize how fallible and how flawed you are, you can begin to take precautions and begin to put yourself in a better spot to actually be great. So yeah, to anyone listening to this, it's not an impossible journey, but it's definitely a hard journey, and you should be concerned, right? Like you should be humble and you should be circumspect about the fact that other smart people have not been successful at this. And without the right sort of education and mentoring, you won't be either. Like nobody just gets into this and crushes it, or not, at least not forever. So,
unfortunately, all the advertisers tell them they will. There's a lot of people who give up their job to earn an income within 1 year, and unfortunately, I guess that's one of these aspects of the industry which I hate. But you came back to that TED talk, and I would recommend anyone listening to go and look at that about that. And I love the paradox that it was called "You're Not That Great," a motivational talk.
Yeah, I've given 3 TED talks. Each one has been less popular than the one before, so I'm not that great either. So that was my most popular one of the 3.
Yeah, Mark, did you want to say something?
Well, I'll start to conclude. Listen, I just want to thank Daniel for such an engaging conversation. Daniel, of course, author of the Behavioural Investor and host to Standard Deviation podcasts, and of course, as you hear, there's a couple of TEDx talks he's proud of that's certainly worth listening to. But we've learned a lot about process, the need for balance, the need for the sort of a human side when looking at markets. And one of the things I think I picked up quite early on was the need for gratitude. And to understand how we impact others and saying good things about people rather than playing to the negative. We've all got this requirement to get on, and saying good things about people on a regular basis is pretty damn important in that. So I'm very grateful, Daniel, for you to cover that early on.
Yeah, I'm grateful in that vein. I'm grateful to both of you for having me on and for the nice things you've said about the book. So thanks very much for sharing your platform today. I do appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure. It really has. Thank you. Thank you for listening to this week's podcast. We hope you enjoyed the interview. We would like to thank the Society of Technical Analysts, whom this show is produced in association with. You can find out more about their services and excellent educational programs by visiting their website, sta-or-uk.org. Once again, if you enjoyed the podcast, we would be delighted if you could rate it or review it on iTunes, Spotify, or whichever service you listen to it on. You can also subscribe for future episodes and view our back catalogue of interesting and insightful interviews with outstanding guests from the world of financial markets. You can also find out more about AlphaMind and the work of myself, Stephen Goldstein, and my colleague, Mark Randall, in helping investment professionals, traders, leaders, teams, and businesses engaged in financial markets to improve performance and effectiveness by visiting the AlphaMind website, alpha-mind.net. You can also follow us on social media or visit our blog page, alphamindblog.blogspot.com. Our Twitter handle is alphamind101, and we also have an AlphaMind group on LinkedIn. You can also find out about our powerful performance coaching program, which is based on a similar program delivered to professionals inside investment firms, hedge funds, banks, and energy trading businesses. This program is delivered to professionals and private retail traders keen to work towards higher and more effective trading, risk, and investment performance. Visit alphamindblog.blogspot.com and go to the menu at the top of the page and click on the link, the AlphaMind Trader Performance Coaching Program. Thank you very much and have a good week.